What happens when a wealthy socialite sends a formal invitation to a black waiter, not out of kindness, but as a cruel joke? And what if he actually shows up? Sometimes, we don't choose the role we're given. We only choose how we play it. That single line would leave an entire room of New York's elite absolutely speechless. How did a man, expected to be humiliated, turn the night completely on its head? And why was this gala talked about long after the last guest had left? You won't believe how one night of quiet dignity can shatter a world built on arrogance. Dear viewer, if you are watching my story for the first time, I humbly request you write the location from where you are watching right now, subscribe this channel and press the bell icon now not to miss the notifications of my daily published news stories. Thank you, and let's dive into the full story. It was an afternoon of champagne and idle chatter at the sprawling estate of Claudia Van Allen, a 45-year-old heiress with a reputation for sharp wit and an even sharper tongue. Nestled in the rolling hills of Westchester, her mansion was a hub for the city's elite, a place where surgeons, financiers, professors, and artists mingled beneath chandeliers imported from Venice. The upcoming summer gala was the season's anticipated event, meticulously planned to impress. Claudia's guest list brimmed with CEOs, media personalities, Ivy League professors, and socialites draped in couture. And, like every year, her luncheon planning committee gathered in her sunroom to finalize the finer details. "Darling," drawled Meredith Kingsley, a jewelry designer known for her biting humor, "this year must be more unforgettable. We need a twist, something unexpected." Claudia sipped her mimosa, blue eyes gleaming. "Unexpected," she repeated. Her gaze drifted across the gilded room to her housekeeper, who discreetly dusted a marble figurine. Perhaps, an unconventional guest. The room stirred with interest. Dr. Leonard Bryce, a renowned cardiologist, leaned forward. "Do tell, Claudia." Claudia set down her glass with a faint smirk. "You all know the waiter from La Belle Époque, the tall black gentleman with the silver watch chain. He served at my last birthday dinner. Impeccable manners, but amusingly misplaced. Imagine inviting him to this crowd, as an actual guest." There was a beat of silence, then laughter rippled through the room. "As a joke?" Meredith gasped between giggles. "Exactly," Claudia said. "We'll extend him an invitation. He'll decline, of course, surely he knows his place. But the very idea, deliciously scandalous. And if he accepts?" Dr. Bryce asked with a chuckle. "Then we'll have a charming story to tell over cocktails. No harm done." The plan was agreed upon amid snide remarks and winking asides. Claudia penned a handwritten invitation on her personal stationery. "Mr. Isaiah Carter, you are cordially invited to attend the Van Allen Summer Gala. Formal attire required. Claudia Van Allen." It was sealed and delivered to La Belle Époque the next morning. Isaiah Carter, 41, was no stranger to such gestures. As one of the most respected waiters at the renowned French restaurant, he had seen the full spectrum of Manhattan's entitled elite. Tall and composed, with skin the color of polished mahogany and eyes that missed nothing, Isaiah had built a quiet reputation for service that bordered on artistry. He spoke little, listened much, and carried himself with effortless dignity. When the ivory envelope arrived, Isaiah read the invitation slowly. His first instinct was to crumple it. He could almost hear the laughter behind the gesture. But something made him pause. Over years of enduring condescension and subtle slights, Isaiah had cultivated patience, pride, and an unshakable sense of self. He had his own private life outside the tuxedo and white gloves, a modest home filled with books, a love of jazz piano, and a wardrobe most of his clientele would never imagine. He had style. And he knew the game being played here. A small smile curved his lips. "Formal attire required," he murmured. Very well. He would attend. Not as a curiosity or amusement, but as himself, unapologetic, poised, and undeniable. The following days passed quickly. Word of the invitation spread among Claudia's circle, fueling gossip. "Do you think he'll come?" Meredith teased. He won't dare, Claudia replied with certainty. But imagine if he did. Invitations were dispatched, caterers hired, musicians booked. The mansion was polished to perfection. Finally, the night of the gala arrived. Guests pulled up in sleek Bentleys and limousines, cloaked in silk, diamonds, and anticipation. Inside the grand foyer, Claudia greeted her guests with customary charm, scanning the crowd with a practiced eye. But as the clock struck 9, murmurs rose near the entrance. Heads turned. The room fell momentarily silent. Through the open doors stepped Isaiah Carter. He wore a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo that fit like second skin. His patent leather shoes gleamed. A silk pocket square matched his cufflinks. No serving tray in sight. He carried himself not as a waiter, but as a man entirely at ease, exuding the kind of quiet confidence that could not be taught. The music faltered, voices hushed. Claudia's smile froze. Meredith's champagne flute trembled slightly. Isaiah met Claudia's gaze and, with impeccable grace, offered a slight nod. "Good evening," he said evenly. "Thank you for your kind invitation." He strode into the room as though he belonged, and suddenly, no one was quite certain he didn't. Guests parted instinctively as he moved, some in curiosity, others in discomfort. Conversations faltered, then resumed in hushed tones. "Who is he?" whispered a gallery owner. "Is he famous?" "He looks like he could be," murmured a hedge fund manager's wife. The evening had just begun, but already the air thrummed with tension and intrigue. And Isaiah Carter, the waiter no one expected to show, had just changed everything. Isaiah Carter glided through the opulent crowd, his steps slow but deliberate, exuding a kind of presence that made people take notice. He wasn't loud, nor boastful, he simply was, and that was enough. The gilded ballroom shimmered under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers. The string quartet in the corner resumed playing, though their tempo was slightly off, the musicians stealing glances at Isaiah as he moved with the calm self-assurance of a man who knew exactly what room he had entered. At the far end of the hall, Claudia Van Allen stood with a group of her closest friends. Meredith Kingsley, her diamond-studded earrings catching the light, leaned in, her voice low. "He really came," she hissed. "And look at him. That tux, where would a waiter even get such tailoring?" Claudia's painted smile tightened. "Perhaps he rented it," she said dismissively. "These people know how to put on appearances." Dr. Leonard Bryce chuckled, swirling his cognac. "If this is a joke, it's one he's playing on us. The man walks in like he owns the place." Claudia's pride bristled, but she refused to let it show. She would remain gracious, unfazed. After all, this was her house, her party, her world. Isaiah, meanwhile, was well aware of every glance, every whisper. He moved easily between clusters of guests, pausing here and there to observe the artwork, or to admire the craftsmanship of the grand piano in the parlor. He carried no drink, no need for liquid courage. He needed none. An older woman with silver hair, draped in emerald velvet, approached him with curious eyes. "I don't believe we've met," she said warmly, extending a bejeweled hand. "Margaret Whitby. Are you with the gallery crowd?" Isaiah took her hand gently. "Isaiah Carter. I work at La Belle Époque." She blinked. "Oh," she said, caught off guard for a beat. Then she laughed lightly. "A man of many talents, clearly. You wear that tux better than most men here." "Thank you, Mrs. Whitby," Isaiah replied, his tone respectful yet unflinchingly steady. Nearby, another conversation sparked. "Who invited him?" someone whispered. "Claudia, as a joke, I heard." "Well, it's backfired. He's impressive." The ripple of commentary grew. Some guests eyed him with suspicion, others with admiration. A few of the younger professionals, bold and curious, found themselves inching closer, drawn to the enigmatic figure who seemed untouched by the invisible rules of this world. At the champagne bar, Meredith fumed. "This is your doing, Claudia." Claudia lifted her chin. "So what? It's amusing. Let them talk. He'll slip eventually, he can't keep this charade all evening." But deep down, her stomach churned. Isaiah hadn't come as an object of mockery. He had come as a man who knew exactly what was being attempted, and had turned the game on its head. A prominent architect, noting Isaiah's poise, approached him with a smile. "Mr. Carter, correct? Quite the entrance. Do you know many people here?" "Not yet," Isaiah said evenly. "Well, you should. This room is filled with fascinating minds." The architect gestured. "Join us." And so, Isaiah found himself amid a conversation on modern design and classical aesthetics. He listened thoughtfully, speaking when he had something to say. And when he did, it was clear, he was not a fool to be patronized. His intellect was sharp, his language precise. Soon after, an acclaimed novelist, overhearing Isaiah's insights, joined the circle. "You've read The Shape of Silence?" he asked, surprised. Isaiah nodded. "It's on my shelf, next to Baldwin." The novelist grinned. "Well. A man of taste." Claudia watched from across the room, her fingers gripping her champagne flute tighter with each passing moment. This was not how she had imagined the evening unfolding. Then came the moment that shifted the energy entirely. The gala's live jazz band had arrived and begun setting up. Guests slowly drifted toward the parlor where the piano gleamed under soft lights. Isaiah moved to stand near the edge of the gathering, admiring the instrument. Its condition was excellent, well-tuned, likely untouched by any of tonight's guests. "Mr. Carter," Margaret Whitby said brightly, "you seem to appreciate the piano. Do you play?" There was a pause. All eyes turned. Isaiah met her gaze calmly. "I do." A few chuckles followed, tinged with disbelief. "Well," Margaret said with genuine interest, "I'd love to hear you." A hush fell as the pianist, overhearing the exchange, smiled and gestured. "Be my guest." Without hesitation, Isaiah stepped forward. He removed his cufflinks, rolled his sleeves with practiced ease, and sat at the keys. His fingers hovered for a moment, then moved. The room filled with the rich, fluid tones of a jazz standard, played with extraordinary depth and emotion. Each note was perfectly placed, each chord resonating with a mastery that left the room spellbound. The music soared, subtle and powerful, pulling listeners in. Conversations died away. Guests gathered near, their skepticism dissolving into rapt attention. When he finished, the room erupted, not with polite claps, but with genuine, astonished applause. Isaiah rose, bowed slightly, and quietly stepped back, unruffled. Claudia could barely breathe. Her joke had become her humiliation. And the night was far from over. The applause slowly faded, but the buzz in the room remained electric. Guests who had barely registered Isaiah's presence earlier were now craning their necks to catch a glimpse of him. More than a few whispered his name to one another. No longer the waiter from La Belle Époque, now he was Mr. Carter, the man who had just stolen the room with 10 fingers on ivory keys. Claudia Van Allen's cheeks burned beneath her impeccable makeup. She stood stiffly, her champagne flute untouched. Around her, the atmosphere shifted palpably. People who had spent years orbiting her social influence were now glancing toward Isaiah with curiosity, admiration, even deference. And that, to Claudia, was intolerable. Meredith noticed the tension in her friend's jaw. "Claudia," she whispered urgently, "you have to do something." "Do what?" Claudia replied coldly. "This is my home. My event. He will not outshine me." But her words rang hollow, even to her own ears. The elegant trap she'd designed had ensnared her instead. She needed to regain control. Isaiah, meanwhile, was hardly concerned with Claudia's disquiet. He moved with easy grace through the parlor, exchanging a few polite words with those who approached him, brushing off excessive flattery with quiet humility. The applause had not inflated his ego, it had only reaffirmed what he already knew. He belonged here, whether or not the so-called elite accepted it. As he stepped into the next room, a vast library with mahogany shelves, he found himself face to face with Dr. Leonard Bryce. The older man gave a tight smile, swirling his drink. "Mr. Carter, quite the performance." "Thank you, Doctor," Isaiah replied evenly. "You must be self-taught." "In part," Isaiah said. "Years of practice. Many hours spent listening, studying, learning." Bryce's smile thinned. "Impressive. Though I suspect you find this evening amusing." Isaiah tilted his head slightly. "Why amusing?" The doctor hesitated. "You know how you came to be here." Isaiah's gaze didn't waver. "Indeed. And yet, here I am." Bryce gave a curt nod and moved on, discomfort evident in his posture. Isaiah resumed his exploration, taking in the room's collection of rare books, several first editions of Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston among them. The irony wasn't lost on him. Elsewhere, the whispers only grew louder. "He's remarkable. Far more polished than I expected. Where did he come from?" In the dining room, an art dealer was saying, "I overheard him discussing Miles Davis with Whitby earlier, flawless knowledge." Meredith pulled Claudia aside. "You can't let this continue." Claudia's eyes flashed. "He won't win this." She called for her butler. "Bring me the guest list." When it arrived, she scanned the names quickly. There, a prominent fashion critic, Margot Ellison, known for her caustic tongue and thinly veiled prejudices. Claudia sent for her. Moments later, Margot appeared in a swirl of black silk and pearls. "Yes." Claudia leaned in. "Our unexpected guest, Isaiah Carter. He's a waiter from La Belle Époque. He came tonight on a whim. Perhaps, enlighten the crowd as to his origins." Margot smirked knowingly. "Leave it to me." Soon, Margot glided into the parlor, where Isaiah now stood speaking with several intrigued guests. She approached with an exaggerated smile. "Mr. Carter," she drawled loudly enough for nearby ears, "what a delightful surprise to see you here. You must find this all rather different from your usual evenings." Isaiah met her gaze calmly. "Different? Not entirely. Music, conversation, good company, these are familiar enough." Margot's smile tightened. "I mean socially. Of course, your regular work keeps you quite busy, I imagine." "I value my work," Isaiah replied without flinching. "And I value an invitation extended in sincerity." Margot's brow arched. "Sincerity, yes. And such style. One might almost mistake you for one of us." There it was, the veiled barb, hanging in the air. A few guests nearby tensed, waiting to see how Isaiah would respond. He offered the faintest smile. "I see no need for mistake. I am precisely who I intend to be." A ripple of laughter, genuine this time, moved through the group. The novelist from earlier grinned openly. Margaret Whitby clapped softly. "Well said." Margot, her attempt at social undermining deftly deflected, turned on her heel. Claudia, watching from a distance, felt her stomach knot tighter. Each attempt to discredit him was only deepening the intrigue, elevating Isaiah further in the eyes of her guests. More conversations began gravitating toward him, drawn not only by the man himself but by the subtle drama now unfolding in plain sight. Isaiah, aware of the currents swirling around him, remained unshaken. If anything, he found the situation quietly amusing. The very people who had expected to ridicule him now struggled to contain their curiosity. And the night was still young. By 10 o'clock, the air in the Van Allen mansion had grown thick with unspoken tension. What had begun as Claudia's light-hearted, condescending prank was now spiraling out of her control. The social tide of the evening was shifting in plain view, and Isaiah Carter stood firmly at its center. In one corner of the grand ballroom, an informal circle had formed, writers, academics, and art patrons leaning in, eager to engage Isaiah in conversation. It was no longer a novelty, it was a draw. His perspectives, carefully considered and eloquently delivered, revealed a depth that many of these supposed intellectuals had not anticipated. Margaret Whitby, now thoroughly charmed, introduced him to yet another guest. "You must meet Professor Lindholm, he teaches philosophy at Columbia." The professor extended his hand, eyes alight with curiosity. "Mr. Carter, your remarks earlier on improvisation in jazz had me thinking about Spinoza's notion of freedom." Isaiah accepted the handshake warmly. "An interesting connection. Both suggest that mastery, whether of an instrument or one's own mind, leads to true expression." The conversation flowed naturally. Around them, more guests began edging closer, listening in with genuine interest. Laughter and thoughtful nods punctuated the air. Across the room, Claudia stood rigidly near the grand staircase. Meredith approached in a rush. "This is getting out of hand," Meredith whispered. "Even Lindholm is hanging on his every word." Claudia's jaw clenched. "He won't be the star of my gala." "You might be too late," Meredith replied grimly. Claudia's eyes darted around the room. Where once she had held court, now clusters of guests drifted toward Isaiah. Even the younger socialites, usually more concerned with Instagram and champagne, seemed intrigued, stealing glances at him with curiosity and growing admiration. Desperation began to gnaw at her. In a final attempt to reclaim the evening, Claudia swept toward the center of the ballroom and called for the attention of her guests. "Everyone," she announced, her voice crisp and clear, "please, a moment." The hum of conversation dimmed as heads turned toward her. "In honor of tonight's gathering, I thought it would be fitting to introduce a surprise game. A bit of light-hearted fun to remind us of the season's spirit." Murmurs rose. Some welcomed the idea, others sensed the undercurrent of Claudia's unease. "It's simple," Claudia continued. "Each of you will take a card from this bowl," she gestured to a silver tray carried by her butler, "and share a brief story about your most unusual or unexpected life experience. A chance to amuse and surprise one another." Isaiah, standing nearby, caught the subtle challenge embedded in her words. It was no innocent game, this was a thinly veiled attempt to restore social order, to expose him as an outsider. The bowl was passed around. One by one, guests drew cards and shared their anecdotes, some humorous, others mundane. A few glanced nervously toward Isaiah, wondering if he would participate. When the bowl reached him, Isaiah drew a card and read it silently. His gaze lifted. The room seemed to hold its breath. With calm assurance, Isaiah stepped forward. His voice, rich and resonant, filled the space. "When I was 24, he began, I traveled to Paris, not as a guest, but as a young man seeking to understand the roots of the music I loved. I found myself in a small club on the left bank, Le Caveau de la Huchette. On a whim, one of the musicians invited me to the stage. I had never performed publicly. My hands shook." He paused, letting the tension build. "But when I sat at that piano, something shifted. I played. Not flawlessly, but with heart. By the end, the room was silent. Then came applause, louder than I'd ever heard. An older gentleman approached me after. He introduced himself, Pierre Michelat, the great bassist. He told me, 'You have music in your bones.' Never forget that." The room hung on his every word. Isaiah smiled faintly. "I never did." For a moment, silence. Then applause, warm, sincere, unforced. Even some of Claudia's staunchest allies found themselves clapping. Claudia's face remained carefully neutral, but her pulse thundered in her ears. Her game had backfired yet again. Isaiah returned to his place, unruffled, while guests resumed mingling, only now, they gravitated toward him with renewed admiration. In the far corner, Professor Lindholm turned to Margaret Whitby. "That man's presence, it reminds me of Baldwin's line, 'Your crown has already been bought and paid for. All you have to do is wear it.'" Margaret nodded. "And he wears it well." Throughout the next hour, the pattern only intensified. The so-called elite of the evening no longer clustered around Claudia or Meredith. They engaged Isaiah instead, seeking his opinions on music, art, philosophy, and even the social fabric of their own insulated world. Claudia, watching helplessly, knew the truth: her own gala had been hijacked by the very man she'd intended to mock. And he hadn't needed to raise his voice, or his station, to do it. He had merely shown up. By midnight, the atmosphere in the Van Allen mansion was unlike any Claudia had ever experienced, not in all her years hosting events for New York's most pedigreed circles. Gone was the predictable flow of the evening, where power and attention orbited her and her chosen confidants. Now, the pulse of the party seemed to beat wherever Isaiah Carter stood. Small groups clustered naturally around him. Guests who would normally hold court themselves, gallery owners, architects, even a senator's wife, lingered near, drawn in by his thoughtful conversation and unshakable composure. The fact that he had arrived alone, unescorted, only deepened his mystique. Claudia stood frozen near the marble staircase, her heart pounding with a mix of rage and disbelief. Meredith hovered beside her, her nerves fraying. "This is a disaster," Meredith whispered sharply. "The entire room is watching him." "I can see that," Claudia replied coldly. Her voice, so often smooth and commanding, now carried a brittle edge. "We have to do something," Meredith urged. "Anything." Claudia's mind raced. The polite facade of the evening could not conceal her growing humiliation. Her gala, the crown jewel of her social calendar, had slipped from her grasp. Across the room, Isaiah was deep in conversation with Professor Lindholm and Margaret Whitby. They spoke of literature, music, and life with an ease that made it impossible to pretend he was out of place. Several younger guests had joined the circle, eager to contribute. Not once did Isaiah boast or dominate the conversation. He listened as much as he spoke, and when he spoke, every word landed with weight. Margot Ellison drifted by, still smarting from her earlier failed attempt to undercut him. "He's clever," she muttered to Claudia, lips tight. "Knows exactly what he's doing." Claudia's jaw tightened. "Then it's time we remind everyone whose house this is." She summoned her butler and, in a low voice, issued her next command. Moments later, an announcement rang through the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, your host, Mrs. Claudia Van Allen, invites you all to the drawing room for a special toast." There was a pause, then a polite murmur as the crowd began moving in the direction of Claudia's voice. Many stole glances at Isaiah, uncertain. Isaiah remained still for a moment, then followed the flow of guests with unhurried grace. In the ornate drawing room, with its high ceiling and glittering chandeliers, Claudia stood poised with a glass of vintage champagne. A tray of flutes circulated through the guests. Isaiah declined, choosing to stand near the center of the room, composed as ever. Claudia lifted her glass. "To friends, old and new," she began. "To the spirit of generosity, of laughter, and of remembering one simple truth," her eyes flicked briefly toward Isaiah, "that we all know our place in this beautiful, fragile dance we call society." The words, wrapped in civility, dripped with condescension. A few of the more astute guests stiffened. Isaiah remained motionless, expression unreadable. "And to those who elevate this evening with unexpected entertainment," Claudia concluded with a tight smile. Cheers. A scattering of applause followed, muted and uncertain. Isaiah waited a beat, then, with deliberate calm, stepped forward slightly. He addressed the room in an even tone. "Mrs. Van Allen, thank you for your hospitality. I do appreciate your invitation." A faint smirk touched Claudia's lips. "But if I may," Isaiah continued, his voice deep and unwavering, would suggest that knowing one's place need not mean knowing one's limits. A ripple of reaction spread through the room. Isaiah's gaze swept the assembled guests, calm, measured. There is room in any society for dignity, for curiosity, for growth. The measure of a gathering such as this is not the titles or wealth on display, but the substance of its conversations and the openness of its minds. He paused, letting the words settle. And in that spirit, he added, I've enjoyed tonight very much. The silence that followed was thick with meaning. Then Margaret Whitby began clapping, once, twice, then steadily. Professor Lindholm joined in, followed by several others. Soon, the room swelled with applause, earnest, undeniable. Claudia's cheeks burned. Isaiah inclined his head graciously and stepped back. In that moment, the balance of the evening had irrevocably tipped. Conversations resumed, but now with a new center of gravity. Isaiah was no longer simply a novelty or an interloper, he was the man who had stood in the heart of privilege and, without raising his voice, elevated the tone of the entire night. Meredith whispered urgently to Claudia, You've lost the room. Claudia's reply was tight and bitter. He'll slip. Just wait. But inside, she knew, Isaiah Carter had already done what none of her hand-picked socialites could, he had made this night unforgettable. And there were still hours left in the evening. It was past midnight when the dynamic of the gala fully turned on its axis. The traditional hierarchy that ruled Claudia's events, the unspoken pecking order of old wealth and newer influence, had fractured. Instead, the atmosphere hummed with the excitement of the unexpected. Guests now engaged Isaiah not out of obligation or curiosity, but out of genuine respect. The lines of class and status had blurred in ways no one in that room could have predicted. Isaiah remained composed, his demeanor as steady as when he had first arrived. Yet he was far from passive, he steered conversations with an effortless touch, never arrogant, always attentive. His words, deliberate and considered, left an impression on all who heard them. In one corner of the vast library, a small group gathered around him, Professor Lindholm, Margaret Whitby, the novelist who had first approached him, and now an unexpected new figure, Benjamin Hawthorne, a sharp-eyed journalist known for his incisive writing on culture and society. Hawthorne leaned in. Mr. Carter, may I ask, what led you to accept this invitation? Isaiah's smile was faint. I recognized it for what it was. But sometimes the best way to address a slight is not to reject it, but to meet it head-on. Hawthorne's eyes gleamed with interest. That takes no small amount of courage. Isaiah shook his head slightly. Only self-respect. The words resonated. Lindholm nodded thoughtfully. And rare insight. Across the room, Claudia watched the scene unfold with growing unease. Meredith had retreated, her earlier bravado extinguished. Margot Ellison, nursing a bitter drink, muttered, He's winning them over one by one. Claudia refused to reply. Her mind worked furiously. Every attempt to marginalize Isaiah had only elevated him further. Now, even her more discerning guests, those whose opinions mattered most, were speaking of him in terms that left no room for dismissal. He should not be in this room, she thought bitterly. And yet here he is, commanding it. But what gnawed at her most was the uncomfortable realization that she herself could no longer approach him without revealing her loss of face. Meanwhile, Isaiah's circle expanded. Younger professionals, designers, architects, artists, began to join in. One young man, clearly from a prestigious background, asked, Mr. Carter, may I ask, have you always worked in hospitality? Isaiah answered without hesitation. It's one of many things I do. I have a deep respect for the craft of service. But I also write, I teach piano to young students, and I study history, especially the contributions of those too often overlooked. The young man blinked. I would never have guessed. Isaiah smiled. That is often the case. Margaret Whitby, standing nearby, spoke with clear conviction. Mr. Carter, you honor every space you enter. I dare say many of us could learn from that. Such a comment would have been unthinkable hours earlier. Now it was greeted with nods and murmurs of agreement. Isaiah glanced around the room, noting the shifting glances. Even those who had scoffed at his presence earlier were beginning to reassess him, some with reluctant admiration, others with grudging respect. Benjamin Hawthorne, watching Claudia from across the room, turned to Isaiah with a knowing look. "I suspect this evening may find its way into one of my columns." Isaiah's smile remained steady. "If so, I hope the message is clear." Hawthorne chuckled softly. "Very clear." Yet not all eyes on Isaiah were friendly. From a dim corner near the grand piano, Dr. Leonard Bryce observed him through narrowed eyes. A man used to being among the most respected figures at such events, Bryce bristled at seeing the attention shift elsewhere. Quietly, he began circulating a different sort of whisper, one rooted in old prejudices. "Impressive, for his background," he murmured to an associate. "But we mustn't confuse charm with stature." Such sentiments were picked up by others of similar mind, though fewer in number than Claudia might have hoped. The tide of the evening was against them. Meanwhile, Isaiah continued moving with the same deliberate grace that had defined his arrival. In the music room, someone had returned to the piano, a guest emboldened by Isaiah's earlier performance. The notes stumbled awkwardly. Isaiah, noticing the discomfort, approached gently. "May I?" The guest gratefully vacated the bench. Once again, Isaiah's fingers met the keys, this time, with a softer, more introspective piece. The melody floated through the room, drawing guests back to the parlor. And as the final notes faded, the applause was louder, more heartfelt than ever. Claudia could bear it no longer. She turned abruptly, leaving the room, her mind awhirl with defeat. Isaiah, aware of her departure, remained composed. He had not come to shame anyone. He had simply come as himself. But the truth of the night was undeniable: the guests who mattered, the thinkers, the creators, the curious, had seen through the thin veneer of class and status. And in doing so, they had found in Isaiah something rare and undeniable. The balance of power had shifted. And the night was not yet over. The early morning hours crept toward 2 o'clock, but no one seemed eager to leave. The Van Allen Summer Gala, which in years past would begin to thin after midnight, still buzzed with energy. And at the heart of it remained Isaiah Carter, calm, unassuming, but impossible to ignore. Claudia had retreated upstairs after her failed toast, her pride battered beyond repair. Meredith, after another half-hearted attempt to rally their clique, gave up and left quietly. Margot, sulking, had melted into the shadows. Only Dr. Bryce remained on the periphery, his gaze sharpening with every passing moment. Downstairs, the rest of the guests, many of whom rarely strayed from their own tightly knit circles, continued to orbit Isaiah. The drawing room now resembled less a gala than an impromptu salon. Conversation flowed freely. Wine glasses refilled. The rigid social structure that usually governed Claudia's parties had crumbled entirely. Margaret Whitby, still vibrant despite the late hour, leaned closer to Isaiah. "Mr. Carter, I must confess, tonight has been extraordinary. I've attended Claudia's galas for over a decade. Never have I seen one so alive." Isaiah inclined his head. "That is kind of you to say." Benjamin Hawthorne chimed in. "I agree. For once, the masks came off. The usual theater of wealth and status has been stripped away." Isaiah offered a faint smile. "Sometimes all it takes is a single unexpected element." Margaret laughed softly. "And tonight, sir, that was you." By now, even some of the more skeptical guests had been won over. A group of young venture capitalists, normally aloof, approached Isaiah with curiosity. "We're hosting an event next month," one of them ventured. "An intimate salon, music, conversation, good company. Would you consider attending?" Isaiah met their eyes evenly. "I would consider it, depending on the sincerity of the invitation." The young man flushed, but nodded respectfully. "Fair enough. At that moment, the room shifted again. Dr. Leonard Bryce, unable to stomach the erosion of the old order, stepped into the center of the conversation. His voice, cool and precise, carried through the gathering. "Mr. Carter," Bryce began, "your presence here tonight has certainly made an impression. But surely you understand, this is not the norm. One night of applause does not alter one's place." The words, though polite, bristled with disdain. A hush fell. Isaiah turned slowly, his gaze meeting Bryce's without the slightest hint of fear. "You are correct, Doctor," Isaiah replied calmly. "One night does not change a lifetime of assumptions." He let that sink in. "But tonight does reveal something else. It shows that merit, dignity, and presence are not bound by the expectations of others. Not by birth, nor by wealth, nor by social construct." A murmur swept through the crowd. Bryce pressed on, his tone sharpening. "Yet surely you must acknowledge, you came here tonight as a curiosity. And you remain, apart." Isaiah stood tall, his voice unwavering. "I came as myself. No pretense. No apology. It is not I who stands apart, Doctor. It is those who cling to the belief that value lies only in pedigree and privilege." The weight of the words landed hard. Even those who had harbored quiet doubts found themselves unable to deny the truth of Isaiah's statement. Professor Lindholm, long respected among this crowd, spoke next. "Mr. Carter speaks truth. It is not background that defines a man, but how he meets the world." A chorus of agreement followed, small at first, then swelling. Bryce's face darkened. He offered no reply, choosing instead to stalk away in frustration. Isaiah remained composed. He had no need to gloat. Margaret turned to him, eyes bright. "It seems you've done more than attend a gala tonight, Mr. Carter. You've forced this room to reckon with itself." Benjamin Hawthorne added, "And there are many who will remember it." Isaiah's smile was faint but genuine. "If they do, I hope it is not for me alone, but for what the evening revealed." The applause that followed this time was not performative. It was earned, honest. In the far corner, unnoticed by most, a few remaining members of Claudia's original circle exchanged glances of quiet defeat. They had lost the night. The power of Isaiah's presence, the calm dignity, the unassailable intelligence, the grace under pressure, had left no room for mockery. No one who had witnessed the evening would soon forget it. The unspoken truth settled across the room: status alone meant nothing when confronted by true substance. And Isaiah Carter, the man who had been invited as a joke, had proven that in the most undeniable way. From the window of her second-floor sitting room, Claudia Van Allen watched the scene below with eyes burning in the dim light. She could hear the faint echoes of conversation and laughter not at Isaiah Carter, but around him, with him. Her guests, the city's elite, were engaged with him on equal footing, as though his station meant nothing. Worse still, they seemed to admire him. It was a reversal of everything she had built. For years, Claudia had maintained control of her circles with unchallenged confidence. She dictated who belonged, who did not. Invitations to her parties were currency. Her word had power. But tonight, all of that had slipped through her fingers, because of one man who refused to play his assigned role. Meredith had long since gone. Margot was nowhere to be found. Even Dr. Bryce had retreated after Isaiah's cutting, graceful words left him exposed. Claudia was alone with her fury. She poured herself a final glass of champagne, her hand trembling. "I made this night," she whispered to herself. "It was mine." And yet downstairs, her guests now barely noticed her absence. The conversation, the laughter, the spirit of the evening had moved on, centered not on wealth or status, but on substance. And the catalyst was the man she had intended to humiliate. As she stared into her drink, Claudia's mind reeled with the injustice of it. How had it gone so wrong? Why had no one supported her? But the answer gnawed at her: Isaiah had not risen above by boasting or posturing. He had shown no anger, no resentment, only quiet confidence, intelligence, and grace. And that was what none of her allies could combat. Downstairs, Isaiah stood near the library, still in conversation with Professor Lindholm and Benjamin Hawthorne. Margaret Whitby had just rejoined the group after speaking with several young patrons. "You've sparked a most interesting discussion tonight, Mr. Carter," she said brightly. "Many here will leave questioning themselves, and that's no small thing." Isaiah offered a small smile. "If the conversation continues beyond tonight, then it has been worth attending." Benjamin added, "It will. I intend to write about this, not about scandal, but about the possibilities this night revealed." Isaiah inclined his head. "Then I trust you to tell it well." All around them, the remaining guests, those who had stayed through the night, listened with open admiration. And something else was dawning among them, a recognition that Isaiah Carter was not just the man of the evening, he was the man who had reminded them of the hollowness beneath much of their so-called status. From the stairway, a figure appeared, Claudia, composed on the surface, her steps slow and deliberate. Conversations dimmed slightly as she entered the room. All eyes turned toward her, not out of reverence, but curiosity. The mood had shifted so thoroughly that even Claudia's entrance no longer commanded deference. She approached the group, her gaze fixed on Isaiah. The room seemed to hold its breath. "Mr. Carter," she began, voice cool but composed. "I trust you've enjoyed your evening." Isaiah's reply was calm. "I have, Mrs. Van Allen. Thank you again for the invitation." Her lips twitched. "You've certainly made an impression." "Not alone," Isaiah answered evenly. "Everyone here tonight contributed." Claudia's gaze flicked across the faces surrounding him, faces that, once firmly in her orbit, now looked to Isaiah with respect. She hesitated, then said softly, "Perhaps, there is more to learn from an evening like this than I first imagined." There it was, not an apology, not quite. But a small, grudging acknowledgement of her miscalculation. Isaiah held her gaze. "Every evening holds a lesson, Mrs. Van Allen. It is how we choose to see it." The tension in the room eased. Margaret Whitby gave a slight, approving nod. Benjamin Hawthorne smiled faintly. Claudia, her pride still raw, offered a terse smile, then turned away, her role diminished. And in that moment, everyone understood, the power had shifted. No whispered correction, no sly remark would undo what had happened. The lines of privilege and exclusion had been redrawn, not by wealth or pedigree, but by the presence of one man who had refused to be diminished. The guests who remained saw it clearly. They lingered near Isaiah not because of the scandal or the spectacle, but because of what he represented: dignity in the face of arrogance, intellect over assumption, substance over show. Upstairs, Claudia retreated once more, her mind racing with bitter truths. Her gala had not ended the way she'd intended. And it would be remembered for precisely that reason. The first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting soft hues across the sprawling grounds of the Van Allen estate. Inside the mansion, only a few dozen guests remained. Gone were the sycophants, the climbers, and the petty snobs who had once flocked to Claudia's galas. What was left was an entirely different gathering, a smaller, warmer, more genuine circle. Isaiah Carter remained at its center, not because he sought it, but because his presence demanded it in the quietest of ways. Throughout the night, he had answered questions, listened intently, and shared stories without ever once falling into arrogance or self-promotion. His calm, grounded energy had reshaped the mood of the entire event. Now, as the sky lightened, Margaret Whitby approached him again, her smile gentle. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, "you've turned what began as a rather hollow affair into something I dare say none of us will forget." Isaiah gave a small nod. "If that is so, then I'm grateful." Margaret looked around the room. It's rare for these people to truly listen. Rarer still for them to hear. Tonight, they did. And it was no accident. Others echoed her sentiment. The novelist leaned in. "I've already started scribbling notes for an essay," he said with a grin. This night deserves to be captured. Isaiah chuckled. Then I trust you'll be kind. Benjamin Hawthorne, who had been observing closely all evening, spoke up. I'll be writing about this too, not as scandal, but as a moment of clarity. You've reminded this crowd what substance looks like. Isaiah inclined his head. That was never my intent. Hawthorne's eyes twinkled. And that's precisely why it worked. The remaining guests gathered around, raising their glasses in an impromptu toast, not orchestrated by Claudia, but sincere. To Mr. Carter, Margaret declared. For reminding us that grace and intelligence need no title. The toast was met with heartfelt applause. Isaiah accepted it with humility. Meanwhile, upstairs, Claudia Van Allen sat alone in her private study, the sounds of applause faint through the thick doors. Her pride was in tatters. The gala she had so meticulously crafted, intended to reinforce her status, had become something else entirely. No amount of wealth or charm could undo it. She had invited Isaiah Carter on a whim, expecting to see him falter. Instead, he had held a mirror to her world, exposing its vanity and shallowness. And now the very guests she had sought to impress would remember the night for him, not for her. In the main hall, Isaiah began preparing to leave. It was nearly dawn, and the city would soon awaken. Margaret approached once more. Will you allow us to host you next time? On better terms, and without certain intentions. Isaiah smiled. Perhaps. As long as it's genuine. It will be, she promised. As Isaiah retrieved his coat, several guests accompanied him toward the grand entrance. Their conversations had shifted, not about the spectacle, but about ideas, about art, about life. The social armor so often worn at these events had been shed. Outside, the air was cool and fresh. Isaiah paused on the marble steps, looking out over the manicured grounds. A few of the guests remained with him, reluctant to see the night end. Benjamin Hawthorne stood nearby. Mr. Carter, whether you intended it or not, tonight you became the guest of honor. Isaiah looked out toward the waking city. Sometimes, he said quietly, we don't choose the role we're given. We only choose how we play it. With that, he descended the steps and walked toward his car, a sleek but understated vehicle parked at the edge of the drive. Behind him, the guests lingered in thoughtful silence. And high above, in her study, Claudia Van Allen watched from her window, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the story of her gala would be told again and again, but not as she had imagined. It would be remembered for the man who had arrived with dignity, faced a room full of judgment, and left it changed. The city stirred to life as Isaiah Carter drove home through the quiet morning streets. The skyline, bathed in the pale glow of dawn, seemed softer than usual. Traffic was light, the hum of the city still muted. After the intensity of the night, Isaiah welcomed the solitude. He drove in thoughtful silence, the events of the gala replaying in his mind, not with vanity, but with reflection. He had known from the start what Claudia Van Allen's invitation had been, a test, a trap, a spectacle meant to amuse her circle. But he had also known he carried with him something they could not dismiss, a lifetime of self-possession, of earned wisdom and quiet confidence. Isaiah had never needed to prove himself to people like Claudia. Yet he also understood the power of presence, the subtle, undeniable force of standing in one's truth amid a room of pretense. And last night, that presence had spoken louder than words. By the time he reached his modest home on the outskirts of the city, the sun was rising fully. The familiar brick townhouse greeted him, its simple lines and warmth a welcome contrast to the cold opulence of the Van Allen estate. Inside, Isaiah hung his tailored tuxedo carefully, brewed a pot of coffee, and sat at his piano, a well-loved upright that had been with him for years. His fingers brushed the keys softly, not to perform, but to center himself. Across town, the ripples of the gala were already spreading. By midday, Benjamin Hawthorne's early notes were circulating among trusted peers. An essay would soon appear in a respected cultural journal, not as gossip, but as a commentary on class, perception, and dignity. The novelist, too, had begun crafting a piece, less reportage, more meditation on the rare moments when social theater gives way to authenticity. Among the remaining guests, word traveled quickly. Did you hear what Carter said to Bryce? Did you see how he handled the room? We've never seen anything like it. For some, the evening sparked discomfort, a reckoning with their own assumptions. For others, it was a revelation that status, in the end, meant nothing if not accompanied by substance. Margaret Whitby, ever perceptive, spoke of it plainly at brunch with friends. We were all taught to believe certain things about class, about place, she said. Last night reminded us how shallow that belief truly is. Even Professor Lindholm, in a faculty meeting at Columbia, made reference to the gala. It was a lesson in humility, he said simply. In grace. And Claudia? In her vast mansion, she moved through her rooms with a bitter awareness. Her carefully curated reputation had taken a blow from which it would not soon recover. The most influential voices from her circle were now speaking openly of how the evening had been transformed, not by her, but by Isaiah Carter. She had invited him as a joke. The joke, she now realized, had been on her. For Isaiah, none of this changed the core of his life. He returned to his work at La Belle Époque with the same quiet professionalism. But now, when certain guests saw him, their glances held new meaning, curiosity, respect, even a hint of deference. Among those who had attended the gala, a few approached him directly, their voices lower, more genuine. You handled yourself with remarkable poise, one said quietly. I learned a great deal watching you that night, another admitted. Isaiah accepted such words with humility, never seeking praise, never chasing validation. He had not attended the gala to elevate himself, but he had left it elevated nonetheless. In the weeks that followed, invitations arrived, carefully worded, respectful. Not from Claudia, of course, but from those who had seen something undeniable that night. An offer to speak at a university salon. A request to join a small gathering of artists and thinkers. A private piano performance for an intimate group of patrons. Isaiah chose carefully, declining many, accepting a few, only those that rang true. And through it all, he remained the same, a man who knew his worth, who understood the weight of dignity in a world too often blind to it. The night at the Van Allen estate faded into memory for many, but not for all. Among New York's elite, it became an oft-told story, not of scandal, but of unexpected grace. A reminder that no amount of wealth or influence could outshine the quiet power of a man in full possession of himself. Isaiah Carter had arrived as an afterthought. He had left as a legend. Dear friend, this story reminds us all, true worth is never measured by titles, wealth, or appearances, but by grace, character, and the way we treat one another. Every day, people face assumptions and invisible barriers. But as we've seen tonight, even a single act of dignity can challenge an entire room. Let's choose to see people for who they are, not where they come from or what uniform they wear. If this story touched you, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember to subscribe to this channel for more stories that inspire, challenge, and open hearts. Together, we can build a world with more understanding and respect for every voice.